Why do we resist change, even when we know we need it? Have you ever wanted something to change and then found yourself resisting the very change you asked for? Maybe you've wanted a new job, a different relationship, a new direction, or simply a different way of living. You know something isn't working anymore. You know something needs to change. And then the opportunity arrives, and suddenly you're not so sure. Why do we do that? Why do we sometimes hold on to what's familiar, even when part of us knows we're ready for something different? Welcome to Conversations with Leanne, where we explore everyday life through both the spiritual and the human side. Not to tell you what to believe, but to encourage curiosity, understanding, and reflection. Today we're exploring, why do we resist change, even when we know we need it? The spiritual side. From the spiritual side, life is often viewed as a series of cycles: beginnings, growth, endings, and beginnings again. We see these cycles everywhere in nature. The seasons change, leaves fall, new growth appears, the moon moves through its phases. Nothing remains exactly as it is forever. And perhaps our lives aren't meant to either. There are times when we recognize that a chapter has ended long before we're emotionally ready to close the book. Something that once felt right doesn't anymore. We might feel restless. We might begin questioning things we once felt certain about. Or we might simply have that inner knowing. It's time. Sometimes we don't even know what we're being drawn towards. We just know that where we are no longer feels like where we're meant to stay. But recognizing that something needs to change and actually allowing that change to happen are two very different things. Because change can ask us to trust, and trust is relatively easy when we can see exactly where we're going. It's much harder when we can't. Sometimes we're standing between two chapters. The old one no longer fits, but the new one hasn't fully revealed itself yet. And that space in between can feel incredibly uncomfortable. We may find ourselves trying to hold on to what was, not necessarily because we still want it, but because we don't yet know what will take its place. Perhaps part of change is learning that we don't always need to know the whole path before we're willing to take the next step. Now let's look at the human side. When we look at this from the human side, it makes a great deal of sense. As human beings, we tend to find comfort in familiarity and predictability. When something is familiar, we have some idea of what to expect. We know the patterns. We know how to respond. We know how to navigate it, even when the familiar isn't particularly comfortable. At least we know it. The unfamiliar contains uncertainty, and uncertainty can make us hesitate. That's why someone can spend years saying, I hate my job, and then feel terrified when they're offered another one. We can know a relationship is no longer right for us and still struggle to imagine life without it. We can desperately want a new beginning and then question everything when that new beginning finally arrives. And I think there's something important in that, because we sometimes assume that if change feels uncomfortable, it must mean we're making the wrong decision. But even positive change can feel uncomfortable. We can be excited and frightened, ready and uncertain, hopeful about what's ahead, and still feel sadness about what we're leaving behind. Those feelings can exist together. Leaving something behind doesn't mean it didn't matter. And recognizing that we've outgrown something doesn't mean it was a mistake. It simply means it belonged to a different chapter of our life. So perhaps the spiritual and the human side aren't as far apart as they might first appear. From one perspective, we might say we're being invited into a new chapter. From another, we might say we're stepping away from familiarity and into uncertainty. Either way, change asks something of us. It asks us to move forward without always knowing exactly what comes next. And maybe discomfort doesn't always mean go back. Sometimes it simply means I've never been here before. Of course, there are also times when that uncomfortable feeling isn't telling us something isn't right. And that's where it becomes interesting. How do we know the difference between the feelings that say, this isn't right for me, and the fear that says, this isn't familiar to me? That's a conversation we'll explore another day. For now, I'd like to invite you to think about an area of your own life where you might be resisting change. It doesn't have to be something enormous. Maybe there's something you've been thinking about doing differently. A conversation you've been avoiding, a decision you've been putting off, a direction you've been considering, or perhaps something in your life simply doesn't feel the way it once did. And ask yourself, what am I actually afraid of losing? What am I afraid might happen if things change? And perhaps most importantly, am I staying because this is still right for me, or because this is what I know? You don't need to have the answer immediately. Sometimes becoming curious about the question is enough to begin. Because moving forward doesn't always start with certainty. Sometimes it starts with one small step and trusting ourselves enough to discover what comes next. Thank you for joining me for another Conversations with Leanne. Until next time, believe and trust. I am Leanne.